I'm Nola Simon, and I'm the host of the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. And one thing I'd like to talk about is how we make decisions and how we filter information in ways that may not actually be ideal. And what I actually want to highlight is a change that LinkedIn is making, which caused a whole lot of concern last week. LinkedIn is, for some reason, they haven't announced why they're doing it. They're going to be removing the location field from the top card, which is where you would see at the top of the profile your name, your headline, and then normally location. And this is where your contact information will appear and all of that stuff. To me, I've lived in a location that has never really served me particularly well. So I was actually born in Toronto, but I moved to Sutton when I was 18 months old. And so I've always lived in the town of Georgina where I live on Simcoe. I went to school here, I went to high school here, and this is where I've raised my family ever since. So the majority of my life has been spent here. But I've always worked, honestly, with Toronto people and companies. And a lot of times the location was a barrier for me in terms of building credibility and convincing people that I was actually dedicated to my work. Until, of course, remote work, hybrid work came onto the scene. And then I could actually work in ways that fueled me more than it fueled the company. And so this is something that I find interesting because for me, location is actually the least interesting thing about an individual. I really don't care where you live. I don't really care where you work. I care about whether you can connect with me wherever you happen to live and work. So again, that is honestly a perspective that I have because of my background. And it's not just the way that I've worked. It's really how I've always lived. Like my parents were super commuters. They would get up at 5 o'clock, 4:45 in the morning, 5 o'clock and commute, and they wouldn't get home until 7, 8 o'clock at night. Like that was my life. That is what I expected would be normal for me my entire career. For me, this location thing is actually beneficial because what I was noticing in all of the people who were complaining about this field being removed, they're factoring this information into decisions before they even actually get to know that person. And from a recruiting point of view, I can understand it because if you're hiring people to physically come into an office, realistically, that person has to be within commuting distance. So I get it. I had one woman who came to me and she said she was based in, where did she say she was? San Antonio? No. Anyways, somewhere in the south of the US, where she said that the majority of the industries that are down there, 75% of them work in person. Arizona. It was Arizona, sorry. And so my first reaction to that was, okay, that's interesting. I can see that valid point. However, my concern about Arizona is if you actually look at what's been happening this summer in particular, the heat is just off the charts. So are people working from home because, or are working in the office because they have access to air conditioning that they can't necessarily afford to have at home, or they just don't have access to it? And what is the future plan for that environment? Because honestly, it's just going to get hotter with everything that's happening with climate change. So how does an area, and is that in the entire state or where she just happened to be located? I don't know. I don't know much about Arizona. But if you've got a whole state that's not necessarily used to working in any capacity remotely, what is that going to look like for the future, 5, 10 years from now, when you may have to adapt because of climate changes? So for me, that's interesting because I'm like, okay, I can see your point right now, but I'm worried that the way that you're operating is actually going to have implications for the future of your business, your individuals, your governments in your state. And that's where she shut down my argument because she said, I'm not interested in talking about that. And I'm like, okay, that's completely fine. But it really comes back to, again, how you're making decisions. Because if you're pulling information and you're looking at people's profiles and the only thing that you're looking at is really whether this person is geographically near to you, and you're not considering whether you've got the skills, the abilities, the background, the personality, the instincts to innovate in a way that could really make life-changing differences for the company and the work that you're looking to hire for, you're limiting yourself in particular. And again, I know that there are factors that go into that, but visas are a thing, legislation is a thing, travel restrictions are a thing. I get it. Like, there's realities, there's obstacles that you would have to work through depending on, what country the person happens to work in. But if you're only limiting your network on LinkedIn to the people who are geographically near to you, boy, are you losing out. Boy, are you losing out. And so that's where I question how people are making decisions and how they're limiting themselves based on the location factor. So if you actually look at other platforms and networks, Instagram doesn't have a location field. TikTok doesn't have a location field. And I get that those platforms aren't necessarily where people are hiring from, but what else are you using the platforms for? What else do you use LinkedIn from? And if you're forever limiting yourself to your location, you are restricting your knowledge and your access to people who could really thoughtfully change your life. I know of one woman, for example, she won't actually connect with anybody who happens to be outside of Australia because her network is built in Australia and she wants to influence the algorithm to prioritize anything that's Australian. I get it, but at the same time, I would never make that decision because I think it's fairly narrow-minded. I know that people in the UK and the US and Canada and Europe and Australia and all points in between, Africa, everybody has a lot to share. And if we're not getting diverse information and diverse perspectives as an individual, as a company, as whatever we're representing, we're limiting ourselves. And so I found that reaction to the location field going away to be fascinating. Because what does that look like 5-10 years from now if we're still making the restrictions and decisions based on location? And we'll have to collaborate as climate change becomes more advanced, as housing becomes different. Say we're looking at family compounds, we're going to have to collaborate and be inventive about how we actually live and work. If you have a family compound, for example, your kids who are now adults might find that they don't necessarily want to live with you all the time. They like having the home base, they like having the flexibility to pool assets and all of that stuff, but they might actually take a career where they can be digital nomads at least part of that year so that they have that independence to travel and experience life in different ways. You, as if you're looking at doing partial retirement or even retiring, you might want to have a home base, have the stability of knowing that your kids are there to look after things, and then be able to travel yourself. And what could that look like? You could really, as a family, kind of cycle through a whole lot of exciting adventures in different ways. And that really requires a diverse network that could be worldwide, depending on where you want to live and travel and work. So for me, it's fascinating to think about how things could work if we really took off our blinders and stopped filtering all our perceptions through our limitations like location. Anyways, and the question that I'd like you to ask, and again, I'm trying to add this into all my podcast episodes, is what are you missing? What are you not seeing because you're restricting yourself? So that's the question I'd love you to ask. And I'd love to hear your answers. Feel free to share with me anywhere on social. And rate and review the podcast. I love good pods. Any rating or review or comment about the podcast and how it can help is really useful. So thank you in advance. Talk later.